Good morning. My name is Talia Kaplan. I'm a producer, reporter, and host with CNBC's Crypto World, a show dedicated to digital assets and, of course, U.S. crypto policy, a big topic on our show. And I'm thrilled to be joined here on stage by a group of wonderful panelists, experts in this field. We have Sylvia Favretto, General Counsel of Mysten Labs, Stu Alderoty, Chief Legal Officer of Ripple, Summer Mersinger, CEO of the Blockchain Association, and Miles Jennings, Head of Policy and General Counsel at A16Z Crypto. So obviously, last month was a big month for crypto regulation. We saw our first piece of crypto legislation become law here in the US, the Genius Act stablecoin regulation bill. So Sylvia, I'll start with you. What's your reaction to that big milestone?
Yeah, it was obviously a really big moment. I think that it was significant because it was really, the first big piece of crypto legislation that showed that Congress can move quickly in the crypto space and that they can operate in a bipartisan fashion. But I think it's also really important because it really sort of validates this idea that proponents of digital asset legislation have had, which is that if you put in place legislation, then innovation will follow. And I think that, from the moment that it became clear that stablecoin legislation was imminent and going to be passed, you just saw a flurry of announcements, right? Be it product announcements, partnership announcements, acquisition, right? There's so many people now who are looking to innovate with stablecoins because of the Genius Act. And so it seems like it was almost like this green light, right, for folks who are on the fence, like, should we enter the space or not? And it also at the same time sort of lit a fire underneath of, folks who weren't traditionally in the space, fintechs and banks where they don't want to maybe miss out or fall behind or lose distribution channels. So I think it was really important for just proving that, legislation can inspire innovation.
And expanding on that, I actually spoke with Congressman Brian Stiles here at the Wyoming Blockchain Association, and he said that when the Genius Act would become law, we'll see a significant investment in the stablecoin space. We're starting to see it now, a lot of interest in stablecoins. In fact, last month during an earnings call, JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon said that he doesn't necessarily get the appeal of stablecoins, but he can't afford to sit on the sidelines. Also, we're seeing interest from Citigroup, from Bank of America, Walmart, Amazon. So Miles, I'm wondering from your vantage point, what are you seeing? Are you seeing more interest in stablecoins now?
Yeah, certainly. I think, across this industry, to Sylvia's point, I think when you give entrepreneurs a level competitive playing field, a lot more people are going to be interested in competing in that space. And so as a result of that, we're definitely seeing a lot more entrepreneurs kind of reach out, come up with new business plans for ways to approach, the space. Obviously, with the passing of the Genius Act, we're going to end up with a ton of different issuers of different stablecoins. That's going to create its own problems that then need to be solved by entrepreneurs. So we're going to see a ton of innovation in this space, and I think that Genius was really the start of kind of a race to build great products.
And Stu, I know Ripple actually launched a stablecoin before the Genius Act was signed into law. Obviously, that was back in December. It's called RLUSD. And also, earlier this month, Ripple said it will buy stablecoin payments platform Rail for $200 million. So I'm wondering, did the Genius Act have any role in your decision to create a stablecoin? Obviously, you knew that it was on the horizon, it was on the legislative agenda. Were you optimistic we'll see stablecoin legislation here in the US?
So Ripple is enterprise facing. Our customers are enterprises, banks, financial institutions. So we follow our customers' needs and what they want. And what we're hearing from customers is they wanted the alternative of stablecoins in terms of payments, even before the legislation took form. We issue our stablecoin from a state chartered trust out of New York, held to very high standards. Those standards, I think, are the equivalents of what we're seeing in the Genius Act. So I think with or without the Genius Act, we would have leaned into stablecoins. But I think what we've talked about, this administration promised to make the US the crypto capital of the world, and the Genius Act is the first major step to make that happen. And we think about it as a crypto bill. But put it in perspective, this is the first major piece of financial legislation that this country has seen in 15 years. The last one was the Dodd-Frank bill, which was completely reactive to a traditional finance crisis. This is a major piece of financial legislation that is proactive, that, as Miles said, is encouraging innovation and doing it in a way that's building trust and integrity. It's really a seminal moment, I think, in the way Congress and policymakers think about technology, innovation, and consumer protection.
Yes, and many in the industry is calling this a watershed moment. Summer, how would you categorize the fact that now we have our first piece of crypto legislation here in the US as law?
Yeah, it really has kind of kicked off a movement, so to speak, where policymakers are very engaged. They're ready to take on the next task, which is a market structure bill. And, you know, I think it was kind of proof that you could do it. You could have a crypto-based legislation. It could be bipartisan. You could get something signed into law, and it really has given momentum to what needs to happen next, which is market structure. So in and of itself, we needed Genius. We needed the regulatory certainty. We needed the consumer protections that are in Genius. But it also gave us momentum to do what needs to happen next, which is market structure. And I think we are on a good path to get there.
Absolutely, and all eyes are on the Clarity Act right now. That's the market structure bill you speak of. And essentially, it lays out the rules of the road for crypto. So Sylvia, I'm wondering, why do you think this piece of legislation is so incredibly important? We saw last month the House passed the Clarity Act. It now moves on to the Senate. What do you think happens there? Why is it so important? And if the Clarity Act does in fact become law here in the US, how will that impact Mysten Labs?
Yeah, lots of questions. So I will start at the top. I mean, market structure is foundational, right? It's not just about tokens. It's about tokens and intermediaries. You know, you have your exchanges and, you know, wallet providers and a whole slew of actors, you know, behind which are individual developers and founders and innovators who really need certainty in order to be able to have confidence to build their products without fear of enforcement or knowing whether they're following the rules of the road when the rules of the road don't exist. So it's really important to allow for that to take place in the US, as Stu mentioned, and folks have mentioned, you know, it will help bring capital and talent and tax dollars and all of those good things to the US. And, you know, one thing that I think that is not talked about enough is that those same builders and developers and innovators, you know, they are proponents of consumer protections and fraud prevention and these provisions in the act that you would think, you know, aren't, you know, just beneficial to them, but they are, right? Because those provisions help prevent, you know, the next FTX or other bad actor, you know, large scenario where, you know, customers and retail have funds taken away from them, right? Because that leads to, you know, fear and doubt on the part of retail users as to whether their assets are safe and should they participate in this industry, and that really stifles adoption. And if adoption is stifled, you know, innovation doesn't happen because the demand is not there. So it's really a net positive for everyone to have those provisions. And back to the, you know, developers in the US point, you know, we've seen at Mysten with, you know, SWE developers that, you know, for the large part, they're largely outside of the United States. It's a real thing, right? Builders who have been born and raised, have families here in the US, they don't want to always take the chance, or they find that it's not even just the risk of enforcement, but there's more favorable incentives in other countries. So it is really important to recognize that a lot of development is happening outside of the United States, and to bring that back, we need to make changes.
If I can just add on 2 points to that, I think that is totally right, and we're very focused on bringing, you know, entrepreneurs back on shore. I'd also say, you know, the stablecoin market represents about 6% of the total market of digital assets. So 94% is really what market structure is targeting. So it's critical, right, that we get market structure done. On top of that, The Genius Act actually makes it more important to get market structure done as quickly as possible because all of those stablecoins are issued on blockchains. And right now we have no regulatory framework for how to even conceptually think about the safety, consumer protection of blockchains. And so without that, right, we're going to have trillions of dollars moving on to these blockchains without a complete regulatory framework, and we need that ASAP.
Does anyone else have anything else to add to that?
I agree with what both Sylvia and Miles has said. We need clarity. Lowercase c should not be controversial, right? And a lot of what we are trying to get back to is a faithful application of the law, because under the prior administration, they stretched the law to the breaking point where these issues were being left to be litigated in the courts and have various judges throughout the country make determinations.
And you know this firsthand.
And we know firsthand. We spent $150 million defending ourselves against the SEC's overreach.
Wow.
And we won that case with some very foundational findings, like the digital asset itself is not a security, which is a foundational principle of what the Senate has proposed. But I think so as I think about the Clarity Act or the Senate proposal, which eventually will be merged together, we need to create certainty for the innovators, we need to create certainty for the market, but we also need protection from regulatory overreach. Right now, we've got Paul Atkins, we'll soon have a new chair maybe, at the CFTC that are leaning into the industry, but that could change on a dime. So these laws are there to protect the industry, protect the markets, protect the consumers, but also protect us from regulatory overreach. I think that we have to be careful that we don't overcomplicate things. It's a very, very complicated industry. I don't know as much about the technology or the regulation as others on this panel do, but what I do know is what it means to stand up in front of a judge and try to explain concepts like what is a blockchain, what is a token, what's a crypto asset. It's very, very difficult. So I think as we build out, whether it's Clarity Act or whatever the ultimate product will be, what we don't need is a Dodd-Frank for crypto right now, right? I think that would be very, very bad at this stage. What we need is clarity. We need simple, principled laws, which will then translate into rulemaking and regulation.
I want to dig deeper into the Clarity Act. It sets the rules for when an asset is considered a security overseen by the SEC and when it's a commodity overseen by the CFTC. So Summer, being a former regulator with the CFTC, I'm wondering which agency do you think is the better agency, if you will, to monitor crypto? I think I know your answer, but I'm wondering why.
Well, I am biased. Certainly I'm going to say the CFTC, but not just because I have worked there for a lot of years and I understand, the capacity of the agency. I think you got to start with the fact that, over 90% of these, what we're talking about, are commodities. They're not securities. So why we would look at a securities regulator as the main point for regulating these assets, it doesn't make any sense. These are mostly commodities, so it really does naturally fit with the CFTC. CFTC already has fraud and manipulation enforcement authority over these markets because of some of the futures products trading. They're already monitoring these markets, they're already in this space. They've got the, people say they don't have the technical expertise. They've been working on digital assets, and they've had futures on digital assets since 2018. So they have spent a lot of time in this space. Principles-based regulator, easier to adapt to innovation. They really are the right regulator for the space.
What role do you see for the SEC in regulating crypto?
Well, I mean, the SEC, of course, has their role where there's, a security, where there's something that happens that looks like a fundraising, kind of activity. But the underlying asset, when you are trading that asset, it's a commodity. So of course, if there's, securities-based activity, fundraising activity, the SEC has their role. But the primary regulator really does need to be the CFTC because these are commodity markets.
Miles, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, and I think that's what both the Senate's draft and Clarity seek to do. So most of, primary transactions where issuers are engaged in capital raising, the SEC has oversight. All secondary transactions, the CFTC has oversight, and I think that that's the right split because the assets themselves are not securities. I think Clarity does and the Senate bill do a good job of kind of deferring oversight of the disclosure process to the SEC, which I think is also the appropriate place to put it given the historic role of the SEC in disclosures with respect to securities. So I think that's a good setup. I think to Stu's point, I do am concerned about the discretion being left to regulatory agencies. I think any ambiguity in a bill can result in unforeseen consequences, and we're already seeing with Genius Act. There are people that are fighting over whether or not what the words mean in the bill. So we really got to be certain in kind of what we're approaching. We view it from the angle of same risk, same rules, different risk, different rules. And if you take that principle, I think it's pretty easy to apply to most digital assets. Bitcoin, Ether, XRP. Right? These assets are not the same as securities. They present a different risk profile, and as a result, they need a different regulatory framework.
Now, the Clarity Act also incorporates consumer protections, including mandatory public disclosures, insider trading restrictions, and measures to safeguard customer funds. Stu, what do you think about that?
Look, I think fraud is bad, and I think we don't need special laws, rules, and regulations to combat fraud. I think regulators and law enforcement agencies throughout the country can combat fraud. I do think on this issue of CFTC, SEC, yes, I agree with what's been said, that to the extent something is a commodity and it doesn't provide somebody with the right title and an interest, and there is really no classic issuer that you can go to make disclosures and hold them accountable to those disclosures, we shouldn't try to fit that into a disclosure framework. And I think that that's what we need to. I think that's what we need to guard against. I do think that these lines are probably going to be a little bit more blurred than we would like. Something at one point may be a commodity, another point you can always wrap a commodity into a security transaction. So I do think the SEC and the CFTC will need to collaborate and work together. But bad actors should be held accountable whether they're trading in a commodity product or whether they're trading in a securities product. But what we shouldn't do is to take something that, so here's the thing with Gary Gensler. He wrote an article even before he was the chair of the SEC, and he advocated for what's called the duck, what he said was the duck test. If it walks like a duck, it talks like a duck, swims like a duck, and quacks like a duck, it's a duck, and he says in his article, and that's how we should test whether something is a security. What we don't need to do is create a high-tech duck test. We need clear, objective factors that you can look to, and what's in the Clarity Act is something that's called the mature token framework. If a token has been trading in markets for, I forget, Miles, whether it's 5, 6, 7, 10 years, it is reached a certain liquidity volume. No single person in control can unilaterally change the blockchain. That's not a security. And the economic reality of it, it is not a security. And we shouldn't try to pull on that thread and say, well, is there an issuer somewhere back in the historical innovation of the historical creation of this token that we can now hold accountable for disclosures? Because that is another third rail. It creates another hazard. If you hold people accountable for disclosures when they really have no obligation to the market, you have created a false dichotomy, and I think you've confused the market, and you've ended up not protecting the consumers.
So last month, I spoke with Democratic Representative Sam Liccardo, and he mentioned that he'd like to see some changes to the bill. He said that he thinks the bill, frankly, could be better and could garner more support if there were certain provisions that were currently missing from the bill added to the language of the bill. One of those provisions, any prohibition over the president from getting involved in crypto. He mentioned other headwinds, including the fact that he doesn't think that the Clarity Act does a good job of protecting DeFi. So Sylvia, what do you think about that? What do you think the Clarity Act does well, what works, and what do you think doesn't work?
Yeah, I think as far as what the Clarity Act does well, I think it really strikes a good balance between not being overly prescriptive, but providing enough certainty to move forward without leaving too much to be left to be done by the regulators via rulemaking. As it relates to this comment about DeFi, I think that a lot of the concerns stem from concerns about bad actors and illicit finance. And you know, I think we shouldn't fear we shouldn't allow illicit finance and bad actors to prevent innovators from being able to continue to play it out and try and create creative solutions for problems that might not exist today. I think that if we put a hard stop on that, then we're guaranteeing that no creative solution is going to exist. And, you know, in some ways, it might be beneficial to accept this period of creativity where, you know, we could allow for a long-term permanent solution that doesn't sort of, you know, deprive the rights of software developers to come to light.
And as we mentioned earlier, the House passed the Clarity Act last month and now moves on to the Senate. The timing, I'm wondering about the timing because obviously, as many of you mentioned, the Senate is currently working on its own version of market structure. So how will that impact the timing of the Clarity Act potentially or even becoming law at all? Summer.
So I think the Senate is working quickly. And, you know, I spent a lot of years working in the Senate, and what I can tell you is they're very slow until they're ready to work fast, and then they move quickly. And, you know, they've made, Chairman Scott has made some commitments to when he wants to mark up a bill, and I know Chairman Bozeman is also committed to getting his section of the legislation done as well. So I think timing-wise, you know, we're looking at fall for really to see what the Senate is going to have, what their package is going to look like, how different that is from where the House is. I know the House and the Senate staff are talking, which is a really important kind of step in this process. That means that they are willing to kind of work together and get language that both sides can live with. So I do think we are on a fast track, and I you know, am feeling more confident that maybe even before the end of the year, we could have a product that goes through Congress and gets to the president. Now, there's a lot that can happen between now and then, but, you know, I'm optimistic that they are headed on the right track to get this done before the end of the year.
And Miles, what do you think happens if it doesn't happen before the end of the year and potentially happens after the midterms? What are some of the consequences? Yeah,
I mean, I think, look, the longer that we don't have a regulatory framework out there, the longer that we're potentially exposing consumers to harm, right? You know, the lack of regulatory clarity creates a very distorted competitive playing field between companies, right? The entrepreneurs that are most willing to take risk and skirt across the law, you know, are going to be the ones that are able to outcompete the ones that are good faith actors and trying to comply with the law. We've seen this play out before, right? We saw, you know, Coinbase engaged in all sorts of and other, you know, legitimate exchanges engage in significant compliance efforts, abiding by all of the laws that are applicable to them. And then we saw FTX come onto the stage, you know, suck up a lot of market share. And we saw what the end of result was of that was. So I think it's really important that we do get this in place. And I think, you know, time is of the essence. I think, you know, it's not just Clarity that the House has passed, right? They passed Fit 21 before that. Clarity's not perfect. Fit 21 wasn't perfect. But the House has a lot of years of experience kind of working on market structure. And so if the Senate is going to move quickly, you know, we would hope that they are able to capitalize on a lot of that work that's already been done.
And Stu, what would you like to see from lawmakers on Capitol Hill beyond the Clarity Act? What would you like to see them tackle next? I spoke with Coinbase's chief legal officer, and he said crypto tax policy is on his radar. Is that something that you're hoping to see? Well,
look, I mean, I think we talked about Genius Act, which I think the speed in which that was adopted and what it accomplished was incredible. Clarity Act or market structure is an insanely big lift that I think we will get to. But it is peeling the legal and regulatory onion, right? As you say, well, We've solved for stablecoins, we've solved for market structure, but what about tax? What about these other issues on DeFi that we haven't tackled yet? So from my perspective, if we can get clarity done in conjunction with Genius Act, I think I will, I'll rest easily for a bit. Yeah.
Wyoming Senator Cynthia Lummis just took the stage before us, and she actually last month introduced crypto tax legislation. Summer, I don't know if you got a chance to take a look at it, but what do you think about the fact that she introduced this bill? What do you think happens with it? What are you hoping for?
I think we will get this, the Lummis tax package. I think it'll get done. I think there's broad support for it. It's just finding the right vehicle. These are no-brainer tax fixes, and it's really kind of bringing the tax code, up to speed with the innovation. So I really do expect that to happen, whether it is in a year-end bill or, however there's a lot of, because it's a tax issue, there's kind of some limitations on how they can put that in a bill. But I do think it gets done. Congressman Smith on the House side has introduced his version. And like I said, there's broad support. People recognize that the tax code needs to be updated to account for the innovation in this industry.
When I spoke with Representative Brian Stiles, who chairs the House Subcommittee on Digital Assets here at the Wyoming Blockchain Symposium, he told me that something he now wants to spend time on is oversight of the regulators themselves. So Summer, I have to ask you, how do you feel about that?
I mean, that's Congress's role, right? Congress should, they have oversight committees of the regulators, and I think that's an important check and balance in our system. So I always applaud Congress being active in their oversight of the regulators. You need to keep them accountable. You want to prevent the next Gary Gensler of, having an agency kind of run wild. So it's very important to have Congress, exercising their oversight abilities over these regulators to make sure they don't get out of line and that they are recognizing that they are not representing the public. They have a very narrow lane that they should be operating in. Congress sets laws, the regulators implement them, and that is something that we have seen kind of go in the opposite direction. So I think the more Congress can keep the regulators in line, the better.
So obviously, we're finally seeing some regulatory advancements for crypto here in the US now, but I'm wondering, do you think that it's too late for the US to catch up to other regions around the world? For example, lawmakers approved the world's first comprehensive framework for crypto regulation back in 2023. That was the EU. So before, I know we're wrapping up, but before we go, I'm wondering if you think the US has a chance of catching up to the rest of the world. Sylvia, I'll start with you.
We are sort of exiting a period where, the United States has been behind, not even in sort of developing laws, but even being open to investigating sort of what the appropriate framework should be. I don't think it's too late. I don't think that even with MiCA and the EU that it's gotten so far and is as comprehensive as some of the, legislative efforts that are included in market structure are. So I think we're at this interesting point where, we were behind, but now we have an opportunity to not only catch up, but to be the leader in many of the areas where other jurisdictions have not put forth really, detailed legislation. But as, we've stated, the window could be small, and so we need to seize the momentum in this moment.
And Stu, what do you think? What region is doing it right?
I think we were dangerously at the precipice of losing the opportunity for this technology not to grow in the U.S. I think with the change of administration, we've been pulled back. I think we have a tremendous opportunity. I think this country is built on entrepreneurs, consumer protection, credible markets. I think if we seize on that opportunity now and we get market structure right, I think we win. If we don't get market structure right and then the switch flips back to a more hostile policy or regulatory environment, I think there is a very credible risk that we will lose out to the EU, to APAC, or maybe even to the Mideast.
And Miles, what region around the world do you think is doing crypto regulation well?
I don't think any of them have a chance of competing with the U.S. if we get it right here. Just a little anecdote. Right up until the election, the main conversation that I was having with entrepreneurs that were thinking about launching a token was, should I exclude the US or not, right? And so that would mean that they would launch their token, right, prevent any person in the US from acquiring it. The second after the election, the script completely flipped, and entrepreneurs were now saying, well, we're actually not going to launch our token in the EU, right? We're going to launch it in the US. So I think this is still the number one place that entrepreneurs want to be. It's still where the markets are the best. We just got to get the legislation right so that we don't miss this opportunity.
And Summer, final thoughts. What do you think happens next with crypto regulation here in the US?
Well, you know, once we get market structure done, it's going to be implementation. And so it will be a lot of work making sure the regulators get it right and don't go too far outside of what has been directed by Congress. So it'll be a lot of work on the regulatory side, making sure that the implementation goes smoothly. So that's, it took a long time with Dodd-Frank. They're still trying to fine tune that. So this could be a long process, but we're gonna be engaged with the regulators and make sure that we get this right.
And Stu, what are you hoping for?
Well, I come back, you know, this is not the industry looking for a free pass or the industry lobbying for some bespoke exception. 75% of the 55 million Americans who own and use crypto in this country want clear rules and regulation. And for the 4 to 5 that don't yet own or use crypto, the biggest obstacle is lack of clarity. And they also want clarity. So I think Americans want this, and hopefully we'll answer that call.
And Sylvia, final thoughts from you on crypto tax policy here in the US? Oh, crypto policy in the US, I should say.
Yeah, I think all of that's right. I mean, I'm just looking forward to, you know, the time when all of this is implemented and developers don't have to worry about crafting, you know, their product launches and protocols, you know, and stacking it against sort of like what they think the existing framework could look like if it applied to assets, and they could just focus on building. And we can see, you know, like we've seen with Genius, new players enter the space and the competition, and let that, you know, just lead to the best, you know, innovations coming to light.
Sylvia Favretto, General Counsel of Mysten Labs, Stuart Alderoty, Chief Legal Officer of Ripple, Summer Mersinger, CEO of the Blockchain Association, and Miles Jennings, Head of Policy and General Counsel of A16Z Crypto. Thank you all very much for joining us here at the Wyoming Blockchain Symposium.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.